As European leaders struggle to get the debt crisis under control, questions are being raised about the latest round of banking stress tests in Europe. What impact will they have on the Eurozone economy, and how credible are they? This is Inside Story. Hello, a warm welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Fears are growing that Italy could become the latest victim of the Eurozone's debt crisis. Worries over the euro currency are growing, and plans for a second Greek bailout remain deadlocked. And with all of that going on, banks in Europe are being told how healthy they are, how solid is the Eurozone, and if they can handle difficult economic scenarios. The European Banking Authority has conducted stress tests on several banks across Europe. So what is the stress test, and how important are they to the Eurozone's economy? Well, the so-called stress tests are conducted on 90 banks aimed at improving transparency, and they hope to persuade markets that the global financial system can cope with big shocks. Shocks like the potential of a country defaulting on its debt. Officials are downplaying the possibility of a Greek default, and Greece isn't the only European economy in trouble. Italy's lower house of parliament will also have to vote on a crucial austerity package. The government hopes to save $99 billion with the cuts, which include a public sector pay freeze and tax hikes. Well, joining us now are our three guests in Westminster. Sony Kapoor, Managing Director of Redefine, a think tank that advises policymakers on economic and financial sector policy. In Washington, D.C., we have Patrick Garofalo, Economic Policy Editor for thinkprogress.org at the Center for American Progress. And in London, Hank Calenti, Head of Bank Credit Research at Societe Generale. Welcome, all three of you, to the program, gentlemen. Good to have you with us. Sony Kapoor in Westminster, if I could start with you. How credible are these bank stress tests, particularly at this time right now?
Well, it depends on what benchmark you use. If your benchmark is the European banking system robust against a scenario where the euro crisis is not sorted, then obviously these are not credible. But if you look at the various microeconomic developments in each country, whether the Spanish banks have enough capital, etc., I think these are far better than the ones done last year, and they're actually not bad at all. But in the presence of a failure to sort out the euro crisis, it is impossible to have any kind of stress tests that are actually credible.
Hank Calenti in London. I mean, I think it's pretty clear by most analyst estimates that this particular round of bank stress tests are somewhat tougher than the tests we had around this time last year. And Sony Kapoor mentioned the Irish banks, which were given a clean bill of health, and then 2 months later they had to be rescued from collapse. But I mean, what are we to read into? Are you confident that they are tough enough this time around?
Well, the tests within the standards that are prescribed, they appear to be fairly tough, but I think the real question is, are we actually applying the right tests at this point in time? So they're better than they were last year, but they're not actually what we need at this point in time.
What do you think are the implications for the ones that fail?
Well, those that fail are going to have to raise capital, and in this market environment, that could be pretty difficult. We'll have to see what kind of backstop measures governments propose in order to recapitalize their banks. And in some circumstances, we'll have to see what kind of backstop measures the EU or the IMF propose to backstop the governments that are going to put capital into the banks.
Patrick Garofalo in Washington, from your vantage point in the United States, where the banks there went through their own series of stress tests before things started to affect banks in Europe, what can Europe perhaps learn from what the United States went through? And on the other side of that, what impact could the results of these tests have on the investment climate and the economic climate in the United States?
Well, I think what Europe has learned is to not make their stress tests quite as big a joke as the American ones were. When America did stress test banks here, they said up front that no banks were going to fail, and then even once the tests were completed, they kind of moved the goalposts as to what merited passing, what warranted passing, to give some of the biggest banks a break. The American stress tests were really about papering over problems in the American banking sector long enough that the banks had kind of earned their way out of their problems. And so it was successful in that sense, but in terms of actually learning anything about the health of American banks, the American stress tests were pretty useless. So I think Europe has learned in that sense that they need to look a little harder and be a little tougher. In terms of the results on the American economy and the American investing class, I think bad results would shake the investment in the stock market a little bit here, but really America is preoccupied with the debt ceiling crisis. All of the political oxygen in Washington, D.C. is kind of being sucked out of the room by the fight over raising America's debt ceiling, because if America defaults, that's our biggest problem, and that's what everyone is going to be focused on.
Sony Kapoor, with the results of these stress tests, can they do anything to restore confidence in the economic system in Europe, or could they do more harm than good?
Well, I think that it's too late for these stress test results, no matter how robust a picture they might reveal, to actually restore confidence in the European banking system, because there's a big elephant in the room, and that is of the ongoing unresolved situation in Greece, possibly in Italy, possibly in Portugal and Ireland. So as long as that question is not addressed, I mean, there's little one could have expected, even under the best case scenario, for these stress tests to have restored confidence. If they had come out earlier, a few months earlier, or perhaps a few months after, where European leaders might actually have sat down and sorted the crisis, though that does seem unlikely at this stage, then I think they would have probably had a calming effect on the market. But again, I think that what it does show, what they are going to show, the stress test results, is that the European banking system continues to have liquidity problems, but the capital aspect is better than it was before, and that absent a big default of, say, the Greek government or the crisis spreading beyond the three peripheral economies, the European banking system should be all right. And I think that's the best we can hope from that they're a good reality check, that under current economic circumstances, if there is not much more deterioration, the European banking system will still be safe. I think that's the best we can say about them. And that's already quite a bit.
Right, you talk about a reality check, but has the reality of the economic situation in Europe really overtaken the scenarios that they put into these bank stress? Basically, what I'm saying is that over the last year and a half, we've had three European economies that have had to be bailed out. Greece's economy is still in a great deal of trouble, and it's not certain as to whether or not they will eventually default. There are problems now with Italy's economy. Greater focus on that right now, this big vote in Parliament. So my question is, are these tests, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, are these tests tough enough? Has the reality caught up with these hypothetical scenarios?
In a narrow sense, yes. So on Portugal, Ireland, as well as Greece, the worst case scenario tested in the stress test has already come true, which means that the margin for deterioration is not there anymore, which was what the stress tests were about. But you've got to, again, take a step back and look at all the various possible scenarios. You know, what's going to go wrong with the Spanish real estate market, what's going to happen in Ireland, what's going to happen, for example, in the UK. So the stress tests are about many more things than just the sovereign risk. And again, even under the best circumstances, one could not have expected the European banking system to be robust in a situation where European sovereigns were not, because the sovereigns eventually underpin it. So I think the stress tests are going to do what one could have realistically expected them to. But to have had stress tests that would have been able to stress banks to a point where, say, Italy was in trouble, would have meant that we would have needed capital levels that were 2 or 3 times what was realistically available. So those stress tests would have actually failed most of the European banking system. And that remains the problem, that you could not test for massive systemic risk. So these stress tests are good for idiosyncratic risks, they're good for isolated risks, but they are more or less meaningless if Italy and Spain get drawn into the crisis. And I think that perspective remains to be contained.
Hank Calenti, we can talk about the volatility that this could bring to the European economy and to the markets, but surely it helps to know where you stand on some of these banks and what kind of exposure they have to debt, because knowing all this, I mean, investors can take certain measures, can't they, to protect themselves?
Oh, absolutely. In addition to getting a pass-fail number in these tests, we're going to get a boatload of information on the exposures of the various banks. We're going to get exposure to each of the sovereigns across the sovereign curve. We're going to get exposure of default data on their exposure to real estate, commercial property, mortgage loans, residential lending across Europe, and as well as commercial lending. So then analysts will be able to go back and beat the numbers, basically, and essentially get whatever outcome they want to see. So that will possibly be part of the problem with these tests, is that come Monday, we're going to see that a lot of people are coming out with different interpretations.
Patrick Garofalo, if I could turn back to you on this. I mean, doesn't it help to basically know where you stand on this and to have the information out there rather than to fear the worst, which is basically what led to the financial collapse in 2008, which started in the United States?
Yes, I think there's absolutely something to that, and having the information out there is beneficial. But I don't think it should be a panacea. I think in the U.S. it was treated as a solution to the problems when really it was just about getting information out there, at least theoretically. You can argue over whether it did or not. But I don't think it should be treated as a solution to any problems, though of course the numbers are helpful.
Sony Kapoor, if I could turn back to you on this. What do you think, taking this a little bit forward, what do you think the long-term impact will be on these stress tests?
Well, I think the short-term impact next week is there's going to be a massive amount of uncertainty and volatility, both because of the new information disclosed as well as the fact that the euro crisis remains unresolved and we are still waiting for policymakers to come up with some solution. But in the longer term, I think that this is going to exert some serious pressure to both get the euro crisis under control and come up with a strong bank resolution framework, because the data that is disclosed, which I think is the best thing about the stress test, is going to reveal the very large, strong links between sovereigns and banks, including across borders in the European Union. And we have already seen in Ireland the banks pulling down the sovereign, and in the case of Greece, the sovereign pulling down the banks. And this situation can be replicated across the European Union. So I think that the disclosure of the data and the closed links and the risks which up till now have been hidden, those coming out in the open, is going to focus the mind of policymakers, and the pressure to resolve both the put forward a strong bank resolution framework and get the euro crisis under control is going to ratchet up significantly over the next few months.
All right, we're going to broaden this out a little bit now and talk about how some of this is related to the ratings agencies and how they have recently been downgrading the sovereign debt on a lot of these countries in Europe, the impact that is having, and whether we should be taking a look at these rating agencies themselves. Nadeem Barber has that now.
As Europe debates how to bail out Greece once again, the indecision has pushed down shares around the world. But politicians are increasingly angry at the big three credit rating agencies, saying they're making things worse.
I personally don't think you can give a rating to a country like you'd give a rating to a financial product or a company.
In the space of just a week, one of the big three credit rating agencies, Moody's, downgraded both Portuguese and Irish government bonds to junk status. Critics say the agencies are spooking the markets. The agencies say they're just being consistent.
We started downgrading Greece and Portugal and other countries way back in 2004, 2005. That at the time was ignored by the market. So now since then, market sentiment has swung to the other extreme. And for countries like Spain and Italy, actually the market is now valuing their bonds at much lower levels than would be implied by our ratings.
Stock markets from London to Japan have been extra jittery recently, following warnings by the credit rating agencies that governments could default on their debts. Now, while many experts say the agencies are simply reflecting reality, some do say it's now time for an alternative. The alternative being floated by politicians like Eurogroup chairman Jean-Claude Juncker is to create European rating agencies. One German financial firm is set to answer that call, promising it'll be different from the American model.
For one, it will be a non-profit private foundation, so that the incentivization of this rating company will not be profit, but it will be a maximization of the prognostic quality of the ratings.
In the US, the credit rating agencies were accused of failing to ring alarm bells before the housing market crash. Now some say they're exaggerating the crisis in Europe, but until there's decisive action in Brussels, they're unlikely to stay silent. Nadine Barber, Al Jazeera, London.
All right, now the basic argument that you heard there in Nadim's report, and if I could turn to you on this, Patrick Garofalo in Washington, is that these ratings agencies lack any real independence because, as they pointed out, they are funded by the very institutions that they are supposed to be rating. So there is a conflict of interest there, the critics say. So what can the Europe learn from that in terms of wanting them to, if they are to set up these European rating agencies, in terms of being able to make them more independent?
I think having more independent rating agencies is really key. I'm not sure on how you go about setting that up or how you make it credible, which I think is the most important question. But there's no question in my mind that the rating agencies obviously missed the housing bubble in the U.S. and are now just wreaking havoc on both the U.S. budget situation and in Europe. Standard & Poor's said that it's going to downgrade the U.S. credit rating even if the debt ceiling is raised, if the U.S. doesn't cut $4 trillion from its budget. That's nonsense. Why does a credit rating agency get to dictate policy to a country? I don't think that's the right thing for them to be doing. So finding some other model, as long as you can make it credible, I think would be a really good thing both in the U.S. and in Europe.
Hank Calenti, can Europeans come up with a credible rating system here?
No, I really don't think so. I think that if you have states that are basically supporting the creation of or perhaps underwriting the creation of a rating agency, it's only because they don't like the ratings that they're getting. And I think, as your gentleman just pointed out in the story, that actually the market is implying much lower ratings than the rating agencies themselves. So the problem here isn't the messenger. The rating agencies are not the issue this time around. I'm no big fan of the rating agencies, and I think they did miss quite a bit during the last crisis. But here they are trying to do their job and trying to tell the market where they really think the risk in the market is. The market is still ahead of them, and they're being blamed for being the messenger. So no, I just don't see how you get a credible European rating agency off the ground in these circumstances.
Sony Kapoor, do we need to do a better job of rating the ratings agencies, or do we? I mean, is the problem with the messenger, or do you think they're pretty credible?
Well, I think, there's obviously a problem with the credibility of the rating agencies. And I think there is some truth to the fact that they're overshooting and trying to prove they're politically independent and ultra-conservative, which is having repercussions in Europe. But that is not the main problem. The main problem lies with the inability of EU policymakers to actually get their act together and end up with decisive action. The fact of the matter is, if my grandmother's savings were invested in Portuguese government bonds or in Greek government bonds, I would like to be warned. And it would be disingenuous to say that the provocation, the discussions on Greece have had no implications on the credit risk for what's going to happen in Portugal and Ireland, or even the fact that the drawn-out long discussions in the United States and the political posturing does not in some way affect its credit risk. So I think that they have been right to point out and stand their ground and say that credit risk is increasing. They have probably overshot. And I think in order to get out of this situation, there are two things that need to be done. One, we need to actually reduce the reliance on these ratings that has been hardwired into, say, for example, where pension funds can invest, what the collateral requirements are. And that is up to policymakers. The EU has been trying to apparently do this since the end of the original financial crisis in 2008, but hasn't really managed to do it yet. And that needs to accelerate. But that is independent from actually the creation of a new European rating agency, which I think is an interesting idea, but it needs to be credible, because if you have a government funding rating agency, which is always saying things that are much more optimistic for governments than, say, independent rating agencies or for-profit or non-profit ones, it's not going to have any credibility. So the best way to to move forward on this is to encourage competition and new entrants. And you can do that through, for example, making sure that every rating that is funded, the money is split into two. One goes to one of the established rating agencies that the issuer chooses, and the other goes into a random pot. And then you create competition and you build up a track record. And it's rating agencies that have a good track record over, say, the next 3 to 5 years that get preferential treatment, and they can then grow. And of course, the second part is to actually reduce the automatic reaction to rating changes. But I think the agencies have been reflecting an increase in credit risk. And if my money were exposed in these markets, I would like to know.
Hank Calenti, I just want to broaden this out a little bit more in the 2 minutes or so that we have left and talk about the wider impact that this could all have beyond Europe. And I'm talking more specifically about Asia. I mean, how concerned are some banks in Asia and other parts of the world how concerned are they about the exposure that they have to these banks in Europe, especially with these stress tests, the results of these stress tests coming out?
Well, absolutely. I'm getting more and more questions from Asian investors every day about the exposure of individual banks to peripheral countries. Their concerns are that they're exposed to banks that have exposure to these problem countries, and has been pointed out here very well, I think. The problem really rests not with the idiosyncratic banks, the individual banks, but it's systemic, and we need to have a systemic solution in the Eurozone in order to get calm in the market.
Patrick Garofalo, if I could turn back to you on this. I mean, especially with what's going on in the United States right now, the debate about the debt ceiling, is there a danger perhaps that they're maybe taking their eye off the ball here as far as what's happening in Europe?
I think there absolutely is. Like I said before, the debt ceiling debate, if you can even call it a debate at this point, is really sucking all of the oxygen out of the room in Washington, in the U.S. media. And so they're really not paying much attention to Europe or to wider systemic issues. And I think that is a big problem. The faster they resolve this debt ceiling issue here, and the faster they can turn to paying attention to other things, I think would be really beneficial.
And just in the minute or so that we have left, if I could turn back to Sony Kapoor for the final word on this. How do you see this playing out as far as the impact of these stress tests, not only on the economic situation in Europe, but in the wider global economy?
I think that United States, Japan, and the Euro area right now are like three crutches leaning against each other, supporting each other. And the only reason the situation in any of them is not worse is because investors have very few choices where else to put their money. And if the US successfully passes the debt ceiling, increases the debt ceiling, then I think Europe is in more trouble. So I think that as long as all three regions, major parts of the economy are in an equally bad situation. We are in a bad equilibrium, but a stable one. And the danger arises when one of them gets out first. So Europe really needs to keep the eye on ball in terms of what the United States is doing, and the United States needs to see what Europe is up to. And ideally, all three regions will be able to sort their house out together, and we're actually going to get a kickstart in the economy. Otherwise, there's nothing but disaster looming ahead, and that's very scary. It's a politically caused disaster rather than something that is a fundamental economic problem. Politics has become much more difficult, much more important in all three parts of the world.
Well, we all certainly hope that those economic situations do get sorted out, and we will be following all of those developments as they play out in the future. But for the moment, thanks very much to all three of you for taking part in the discussion. Sony Kapoor, Patrick Garofalo, and Hank Calenti. Many thanks for your time. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us anytime, remember, at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.